Welcome to the Infinite Women podcast. I'm your host, Allison Tyra, and today I'm joined by April White, author of The Divorce Colony: How Women Revolutionized Marriage and Found Freedom on the American Frontier. So, first, could you introduce us to the context of marriage and divorce in the US at this time?
All right, so we are in about 1890 as the book starts. And what's going on at this moment is that over the course of the previous, say, 50 years, we've seen divorce become a little bit democratized in terms of access. We've seen divorce go from the legislatures, where you used to have to get a private bill of divorce, to the courts because the legislatures had other things to do. Uh, and in the courts, either the man or the woman could file for divorce. Now, that didn't mean it was equally available, of course, because there were a lot of other things that controlled who sought divorce and when and how. And one of those things for a lot of the 19th century was the fact that married women were considered legally an extension of their husbands, which meant that you could not own property and therefore didn't have the economic means to leave your marriage. But by the time we get to 1890, we're seeing that change. This idea that women are an extension legally of men has changed. Married women can start to own property. And so we're seeing this moment where there is more, not a lot, but more ability for women to seek a divorce legally and possibly economically. But we're still seeing at this time a great deal of social dissuasion from seeking a divorce. So the idea of divorce is really an anathema in the United States. And to seek one would be to separate yourself from a lot of your communities, perhaps from your family, perhaps from your religious community, perhaps from the town you grew up in, and be seen as sort of an other. So that's the moment that we're in when this book starts.
So that brings us, or rather the hopeful soon-to-be divorcees, to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Why was this such a popular destination?
You wouldn't expect it, right? I mean, we're talking about a small town on the frontier. It's only been around for about 15 years. It is all the way at the end of the train line. It takes days to get there from the East Coast, which is where many of these women are coming from. But South Dakota, just recently a state, has the laxest divorce laws in the country. And if you go and you stay there for at the time, 3 months, later this would get longer, but at the time, if you stayed there for 90 days, you fell under the jurisdiction of the courts. So this was an opportunity to get a divorce and to sort of leave the social pressures of your community and seek that divorce elsewhere. Now, as to why Sioux Falls, because all of South Dakota had this law, Sioux Falls was the easiest town to get to from the East Coast, and it was also home to the best hotel for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles. So the women that you have traveling out to Sioux Falls were typically wealthy women. This was not a cheap endeavor. And this was the closest thing to what they knew that they had found in South Dakota.
Yeah, I'm just picturing it as like a tourism slogan. Come to Sioux Falls, get divorced.
There was a moment when what became called the divorce colony first started, when women first started coming from the East Coast out to Sioux Falls, where some of the people in town thought, "Oh, hey, we can make some money off of this." So there was a moment before the spotlight also came to Sioux Falls, where the entrepreneurial residents of the town thought that maybe this is a way that they were gonna really make their mark.
Now, I know there's this image of the Wild West, but apart from removing yourself from your community where people know you and where there is that social pressure, whether that's from your friends, from your family, from because these were society women, right? This was a very privileged group, so that society pressure. But apart from just getting away from all of that and sort of having that freedom and space to breathe, I would say. But culturally, how was the American frontier different from I'm sure what they would have considered civilized parts of the coast?
So, an important thing to recognize is that the laws in South Dakota were not laxer because this was a pioneering place for women. But they were laxer because this was the frontier. So, throughout the 19th century, you sort of see the laxest divorce laws always existing at the edge of the settled United States. And it's because as people, as white settlers pushed west, and as they brought their laws and their understanding of how culture should work to these communities, they often needed people. They needed people to populate the towns, to participate in civic life, to just make things happen. And so frequently, things like the number of days it took to fall under the jurisdiction of the court, how long you needed to be a resident in order to vote or to hold office. These things were much shorter because they needed to be. Everybody was new. And so we sort of see a bunch of different locations across the course of the 19th century become a destination for migratory divorce. You know, we see it happen in Pennsylvania or Indiana or Illinois. We just keep seeing it moving west. South Dakota was that destination at the moment the country started becoming very concerned about divorce. This happens for a bunch of reasons. You know, we sort of have this upheaval, this questioning of what marriage is, this questioning of what family is, this questioning of if the family is not the economic unit running a farm, what is it? But what also happens in this moment is the US government decides to count for the first time the number of marriages and divorces that have taken place in the country. And suddenly, these sort of anecdotal fears have a number. Now, no one has a lot to compare this number to, but it seems big. Um, and that sort of starts this fear around the plague of divorce and the divorce question, as it was known. So, South Dakota was following the same path that every other frontier community had followed. It just happened to do it at the moment that fears around divorce coincided with the growth of this community. So that's how South Dakota ends up being vilified for the same thing that happened every place else. Now, what gets interesting in Sioux Falls and in South Dakota is that up to this point, it was pretty clear and pretty consistent that once a place was settled, once they weren't trying to draw in residents with the same sort of urgency, those laws changed and they got stricter and they began to resemble the same things you would find on the East Coast. And I should point out that was pretty diverse, and I'll touch on that in a minute. What happened in South Dakota ends up being different in part because of all the attention they get. So things do ultimately get stricter in South Dakota, but it's a fight. It's a fight you never would have had elsewhere. And that makes this a tipping point in how we think about divorce in the United States. So at the time, at the end of my book, spoiler alert, what ends up happening is South Dakota decides to make its laws as strict as any other place. At the time, this seems, in the moment, like a victory for the people who oppose divorce. That doesn't turn out to be true. What turns out, what we can see from a distance, is that this was the last time that was going to happen. That this was a really Pyrrhic victory because they had tried incredibly hard to stop divorce, and that's not what they end up accomplishing. They simply make it harder in one state to do that. But to my earlier point about the diversity of laws, and I think this is an important one to understand, what ends up driving this idea of migratory divorce is that every state has its own laws. And those were very, very different. So in South Carolina at the time, there was no provision for divorce at all. You could not be permanently legally separated from your spouse, except for this very brief 7-year period in South Carolina. In New York, you could only divorce your spouse with proof of adultery. This was an adversarial process, so you had to go to the court, accuse your spouse of adultery, and bring evidence. And if the judge did not believe your evidence, you would still be married at the end of that proceeding. And if you and your spouse had, say, decided mutually that you wanted to get divorced, you still had to go through this process. And if it was discovered that you had colluded, collusion was against the law in most states. So if it was discovered that you and your spouse mutually wanted to end your marriage, you could not. So you understand why people started thinking about how they would do this outside the confines of some of these laws. Um, People are going to end their marriages, whether you tell them they can or not. So you have just extra legal decisions of, all right, we're just going to live separately. You have instances of desertion. Um, People who just decide to move to a different state where without the internet and, easy communication, hey, maybe no one will ever figure out they're married. You have a lot of bigamous marriages for this reason. People who simply didn't know or didn't care that their spouse had previously been married to someone they had left a long time ago. The problem with all of these extra legal means, well, big problem with the one where you murder your spouse, but the problem with the ones that don't end in someone getting physically injured is that women often didn't have access to them. It was much more difficult if you did not have the economic means to walk away from your marriage. It was much more difficult if you had to worry about the legitimacy of your children. If a man wanted to walk away from his children, he could do that too and claim they were not his. It was a much more challenging to impossible task for the woman. And at the time, marriage was the single most important social, economic, and political decision a woman could make in her lifetime. So to walk away from a marriage without a divorce meant you could not legally marry again. And that left you outside of a lot of things that you needed to function in the community. Um, and that's why, we end up seeing two things are going on when I'm talking about women traveling to Sioux Falls. One is you have more women who need that piece of paper because they need the opportunity to marry again. The second thing, and the reason I talk about the women so much in the book and why it's about them, is because, of course, it was their presence in Sioux Falls that caused all the trouble. There were also men who traveled to Sioux Falls to get divorces. And, people didn't love that, but they didn't cause the same consternation, the same panic that women demanding divorces did.
So I'd like to dig more into divorce as a women's rights issue. And you note in the book that two-thirds of divorce seekers in the latter part of the 1800s were women, because as you were just telling us, men didn't have as much need or incentive for that legal piece of paper. So we know that there is a correlation between, over time, women gaining more rights and divorce becoming more accessible, both legally and practically. But this panic that you were talking about, and this fact that even today we see conservative politicians wanting to make divorce more difficult, like they're wanting to take it back to when it was harder for women to get out of a bad marriage. So, from your perspective, what does the patriarchy gain from keeping women trapped in marriage?
Nothing, but that's not what they think. At the time, in the period of time I'm talking about, you see this real belief that families are the fundamental building block of the country. That if the family crumbles, the country crumbles. And in order to maintain that structure, there was a belief that women could not pursue opportunities beyond the family, or outside the family. And that is a lot of what's driving it. So we see that general idea coming from the religious leaders of the time, coming from the courts of the time, coming from the political leaders of the time, that this is a nation building project. You raised the idea of women's rights, and this is actually something I wish I could write a whole thesis on, and I touch on only briefly in the book, is the intersection between the suffrage movement at the time and the women's rights movement at the time and divorce. And this really, really splits the women's rights movement and the suffrage movement at the time. There are people who believe that suffrage is so much more important than the conversation of divorce, and divorce will derail any attempts to gain the vote. And then there are people who believe that if you can't decide your basic, most intimate relationships, then you do not have freedom. And so, therefore, this is far more important than the vote. Ultimately, it ends up sort of getting sidelined because the only way to hold this coalition together of suffragists, particularly ones that come from a religious background, was to not pursue the divorce question. Um, but it has a really uneasy place in the women's movement from this period of time, even though from a distance, the rights seem really intertwined. Um, so one of the things I found really interesting when I started researching this book is that none of what I'm talking about is a political effort by these women who are going out to Sioux Falls to make divorce more available. Each of the people who are going out there simply want to end their own marriages. None of them are out there as activists. All of them are out there for personal reasons. And I find that pretty fascinating because they ultimately do end up making big change. But I'm fairly certain if any of them could have gotten quieter divorces, divorces that didn't put them on the front pages of the newspapers, that didn't require them to leave their homes for a year, they would have. So I can't credit them with thinking about us, but they did help us out.
So let's get more into these women and their story because the book is described as telling readers about the journey of four women who took their lives into their own hands and forever changed the country's attitudes about marriage and divorce. And I think part of why they were impactful was perhaps because they weren't activists and because they were highly privileged, as mentioned earlier. So the fact that these weren't women that you could point at and say, oh, they're one of those rabble-rousing suffragists, you can't make that claim about women who are just saying, I just want to leave my own marriage. I'm sure people did, but it's a little harder to argue that case. Like, it's why, like Rosa Parks, for example, was a longtime activist, but the story that we hear about her is, oh, she's a seamstress and she was just tired after a long day of work and she just couldn't do it anymore. And it's like, no, she knew exactly what she was doing. It was strategic. But we
Mhm.
tell that narrative because it shapes how people receive her actions. And so I find it very interesting that these women legitimately were not activists. I don't want to say they were only out for themselves because it sounds kind of mean to say it like that, but that is what was happening.
They
Their
were
own.
only out for themselves in the same way that any person today who seeks a divorce and seeks to leave their marriage is making a personal decision. These women just happened to have to do it in the national spotlight. And that spotlight led to change. Um, so yeah, I tell the story of the divorce colony through the stories of four particular women. I took this approach for a couple of reasons. The first is the divorce colony ends up covering a little less than 20 years, from about 1890 till just before 1910. And I wanted to make sure you could understand the whole evolution of the divorce colony because what happens in Sioux Falls and the way attitudes change in Sioux Falls is a mirror for how they end up changing nationally. I also chose these women and to tell it through their stories because I wanted you to feel as best you could what it took to do this, what it meant to make the decision to divorce, and what sacrifices these women had to make in order to gain this freedom. Each of these women is white and is from a level of privilege. They are, however, really different in their stories about why they married and why they were getting a divorce, what they expected love and marriage to be, and how they planned to make their way in the world after the divorce. So it was really helpful to me to be able to show a spectrum of how people were interacting with the idea of divorce. And so the story starts off with a woman named Maggie DeStewers. She is a niece of the Astor family. The Astor family basically owned Manhattan at this time. And Maggie was herself quite wealthy independently. She had married a Dutch baron because it was very fashionable when Maggie got married to marry a European title. And she went off to Europe and, sort of moved between the fashionable European capitals, staying in the resort towns and the big cities and, just live this sort of wealthy life that you imagine. Her marriage was not great, as she testifies. She testifies that her husband was constantly paranoid, certain she was cheating on him, verbally abusive. The things that you saw on the surface of their marriage, the things that felt like the typical well-to-do marriage, were not true at all. Maggie's story ends up coming to a head for her one night in Paris when she comes to the conclusion that her husband is trying to institutionalize her so that he can gain control of her fortune and her children. So she flees from Paris at night with her maid and whatever jewels she can carry and disappears for a year. And then she resurfaces in Sioux Falls. And this makes the front pages of newspapers all over the country. They've found Maggie DeStewers and she is in Sioux Falls. And Sioux Falls will become a shorthand very quickly. Going to Sioux Falls will become a shorthand for getting a divorce. But this is sort of the beginning of the story, or the beginning of the country knowing the story anyway. So it's kind of like baffling as to why she's there. And then very quickly, people say, oh, this is why she's gone. She's going to get a divorce. Maggie ends up having a public trial in the courthouse in Sioux Falls, filled to capacity, both the galley and the mezzanine, with people who are just wanting to see a soap opera. Her husband does not show up. He stays in Europe. However, he sends a 70-page deposition, which the lawyer reads out loud, accusing her of many, many, many things. She gets up on the stand. She testifies publicly before, all of these people and the whole country, because of the reporters there, to all the darkest moments of her marriage. She does ultimately get her divorce, but this is what it requires.
Out of curiosity, is there a reason she didn't divorce while she was in Europe? Because surely, with all those countries around, I would think that one of them would have decent divorce laws.
France at the time did. Maggie's case was a little complicated. Her husband was a Dutch diplomat and she was living in Paris. So, where she was legally able to get a divorce was a little complicated. The divorces you got in Sioux Falls were very tentatively legal. Very unclear whether that was going to be honored when you got home. My presumption, and I can only know what Maggie has left for us, but my presumption is she felt most urgently the need to get away from her husband. That is sort of how this happened. Now, I will say I was able to discover that Maggie had learned about Sioux Falls divorce laws, we're not quite to the colony point yet, from a book that she picked up from a Parisian bookseller. And she knew about Sioux Falls because her uncle had helped build the town. He had given money, her aunt and uncle had given money to build the Episcopal Cathedral there. And he thought it was a wonderful place. This ends up becoming a real problem for both Maggie and Sioux Falls because Bishop Hare, whose home church is the St. Augusta Cathedral, named in honor of Maggie's aunt, is home to Bishop Hare, who is the most outspoken critic of divorce in Sioux Falls. So, he has these religious reasons and this very paternalistic reasons for opposing divorce. But it becomes very clear that one of the things that sets him on a nearly 20-year path to opposing the divorce colony is his just affront that someone with whom he is associated would seek a divorce in such a public manner.
So it's sort of that whole getting away from your judgmental community created a degree of freedom, unless you're Maggie.
Yes, yes, she didn't have a lot of luck there. And she attended his sermons. I mean, she was a member of his parish, and he spoke out against her regularly. So the divorce was bad enough for Bishop Hare. Maggie remarries a couple of days later, and that was a real scandal.
Wow. I think we know what she was doing during that year away. Good for
Yes,
her.
yes, I think we do. Um, but Maggie kicks off the idea of the divorce colony. Her presence there brings the reporters, and she is not alone there. By this point, there are many, many men and women living at the Cataract House Hotel, filling their idle hours with all of the same entertainments that they might have sought in, New York. They have dance classes, they go sledding and riding. So Maggie brings all of the attention to Sioux Falls. She is not the first person to come there to seek a divorce. The Cataract House Hotel is filled with men and women who are waiting out their time, waiting out their sentence, as they would say, because they need to wait 90 days before they're residents of South Dakota. And then they can file their divorce suit. So they have to wait another indeterminate period of time for their suit to pass its way through the courts. They'll be there for 6 months, 9 months, maybe a year if things aren't going well. And they have to fill the hours. So you see them playing cards and taking dance lessons and drinking, even though this is a prohibition town at the time. You see them sledding, you see them skating on the river when it freezes over, and going horseback riding in the spring. All of which really keeps them alienated from the community itself. They're really living a life that is outside what the Sioux Falls community is doing, and sort of adds to the dislike between these two groups. But Maggie starts the story because Maggie starts the story for the American public. This is their first exposure to what the divorce colony is. The second person I write about in the book is a woman named Mary Nevins Blaine. She is out in Sioux Falls with her young son, and she is divorcing the son of the Secretary of State. James Blaine is one of the best known people in the country at this time. And his youngest son, Jamie, is a bit of a ne'er-do-well. But Mary and Jamie had fallen in love, and then they had eloped, much to the dismay of both of their families. And then eventually, Mary decided that the youthful indiscretions of her husband were never going to change. He seemed to have a bit of a drinking problem, seemed to have a bit of a temper. And so she went out to Sioux Falls for a divorce. What I get to tell through her story is how politics and divorce interacted at this time. Because we're about to see her father-in-law try to run for president again. And so you really see this spotlight on the dysfunction of his family, and her divorce becomes an issue. I like her case a lot because no one expected her to be a formidable foe for the standard bearer for the Republican Party. She was a young actress of no acclaim, you know, and no one expected her to stand up to this powerful family. And she does. Um, Ultimately, James Blaine takes her on the front pages of the paper, writing this open letter accusing her of terrible things. And she gives back as good as she gets, threatening to release letters that his son has sent her and place blame on his wife, which really concerned him. She claimed that her mother-in-law was the cause of trouble in her marriage. But I like her story because you can see what it took to wage sort of the public relations campaign that would try to maintain your reputation when you sought out a divorce. Most people didn't have to do it at the scale that Mary did, but you did have to do it. You did have to try to find a way to stay in your community. Maggie never managed to. Maggie was never accepted by her family again. Mary does find a way back into society. So both Maggie and Mary had kids. Maggie had, at the time, two living sons and a daughter. She sued for custody of the daughter, who was the youngest, and she believed the most in need of motherly affection. Uh, she never saw her daughter again. She was in France and her husband had hidden away her daughter. It's unclear to me if the daughter had any interest in being found. She would have a contentious relationship in the papers with her mother all her life, but she never managed to reclaim her children. Mary was out in Sioux Falls with her son, James Blaine III, and she held on to custody of him over the objections of Jamie's family. It wasn't clear to me that Jamie had any interest in being a father, but the grandparents were very interested in reclaiming it. The question of custody was not often central to these divorces. It was often something that would be negotiated separately and often between the parties. It also often depended on the age of the child, rather you needed a maternal influence in the child's life still, or if it was thought that the father could be a better guide for an older child. But it was not as prominent as one might expect, given the way we think about divorce and family arrangements now.
I do wonder if part of why they wanted him badly enough to fight for him was also because, oh, it's a boy and it's the heir, and our own son is not an appropriate heir, so we need to like groom the young boy to be the heir apparent.
That seems entirely possible. They were definitely a family that thought in dynastic terms. You know, they were a family that saw themselves at the forefront of American culture and American politics long term. So I could absolutely see that.
And then next you have Blanche Molyneux.
So Blanche comes into our story much later. Maggie and Mary both come seeking a divorce in 1891. And after their experiences and the experiences of many other divorce seekers out there in the early 1890s, South Dakota makes a change. with Bishop Hare leading the crusade, they extend their residency requirement. So, what was a 3 month requirement, 90-day requirement, becomes a 6 month requirement. Suddenly, South Dakota does not have the easiest divorce in the country. And I use the word easiest, and I always have to stop and correct myself because this was not easy. It was simply the easiest. Now that distinction, honor, dishonor, belongs to North Dakota. So you could have had a divorce colony form in North Dakota, but not a lot of people wanted to spend that kind of time in Fargo. It did not have the same amenities for travelers from the East that Sioux Falls did. So, what you see happen after 1893 is people still come to Sioux Falls for divorces, but the notoriety is gone. That, superlative of easiest, that is gone. So things are quite quiet. The other thing that happens is a terrible economic downturn. And what we see is that, again, you'll learn this at the end of the book, but hey, it's history. So, uh, what we'll see is that despite all the efforts that happen to make divorce less common during this period of time, the only thing that actually slows the divorce rate is an economic downturn. The only thing that slows the divorce rate is the actual inability to support yourself outside of a marriage. So things have changed by the time Blanche Molyneux shows up in Sioux Falls in the early 1900s. She's there because the laws have changed once again. North Dakota in the late 1890s decides it doesn't want this distinction, and they make their residency requirement longer, taking it to a year, which is pretty much the same as most other places. So now suddenly the 6 month in Sioux Falls is again the shortest residency requirement. People have started coming back to Sioux Falls. Blanche Molyneux is just following in their footsteps, but it's been pretty quiet until Blanche shows up. Blanche ignites another firestorm around the divorce colony, and it happens for two reasons. One is that Blanche is known as the murderer's wife. Blanche has been on the front pages in New York for like 2 years at this point, because her husband was convicted and sentenced to death for poisoning, and then that was overturned. Okay, so this case is pretty complicated, but there's only a couple of things that you need to know. The first is that he was believed to have murdered two people. One was the relative of someone with whom he was a rival of in the social club he belonged to. The logic was that he had accidentally poisoned this woman while attempting to poison his rival. The other person was a former lover of Blanche's. He was convicted in the death of the relative of his rival. That was ultimately overturned on some evidentiary procedural things that are still sometimes cited in New York law. He was tried a second time and he was acquitted. So now Blanche, who believes that he poisoned her former lover in order to win her affection, has no cause for divorce. She lives in New York. She didn't accuse him of committing adultery. She simply thinks he committed murder.
You mentioned that this guy was her lover, which makes me wonder when we're talking about adultery as grounds for divorce, if the woman committed adultery, apart from obviously the, social reputation impacts that would have, like, did she have the option of just going, sleeping with someone else, and then filing for divorce on the grounds that she committed adultery?
Unfortunately, no. That would give her far too much control. No, Roland, her husband, he could have tried to prove and get a divorce, but he did not wish to seek that. So Blanche got on a train to Sioux Falls. She had, at the insistence of her husband's family, stood by her husband through all of these machinations in the courts. She had been accused by the lawyer in the case of being the motive for the murder, because although Roland was not charged with the death of her lover, it was a much better story than that complicated one I tried to tell you about the relative of the rival. So it became the narrative of the murder trial, even though it wasn't the actual charge. So when she arrives in Sioux Falls, the attention comes with her again, the same way it did for Maggie. However, what Blanche does is she admits to why she's there. She tells the press that I am here for a divorce because I believe I deserve my freedom. That puts her in legally dicey territory because you're supposed to come to Sioux Falls to become a resident of South Dakota. And there's a question as to whether you come simply for a court case thwarts that motive. Um, and it most certainly makes her a target.
So she said the quiet part out loud. Like everybody knew that all these rich folks weren't just coming here
Yes.
because they wanted to vacation for months in Sioux Falls.
Yes, yes, everybody knew that. And they would make these sort of polite fictions about how lovely it was to be in Sioux Falls and what great diversions there were. But yes, everybody knew. Blanche simply said it. Blanche had, again, quite privileged to be able to do this. However, she had come from a much less wealthy family. She'd married into wealth, but her family, her father had been this sort of itinerant inventor. And sometimes he was doing well and sometimes he wasn't. And, she largely supported herself singing. She was an actress and a singer, singing in church choirs and, singing in New York. So she did not come from a wealthy background, although she wanted to live it. She wanted to live that, New York arts lifestyle. And that's why she married. She had come to this conclusion that if she wanted to pursue a career as an artist, if she wanted to get the singing training that she desired, she needed to be economically stable. And this man was, in theory, going to be her economic stability. Um, but so Blanche did not have the same social concerns that a lot of these other women did. And you would see her often making mistakes and violating those unwritten rules. And it sort of made her a pariah even within the divorce colony. Um, but the interesting thing that happens with Blanche is that she gets a divorce. And unlike, I want to say, every other woman who came there, I can't actually prove that, but I've not encountered another woman who did this. Unlike every other woman, asterisks, who did this, she doesn't leave the next day. The rest of these people get back on a train immediately and go back to their lives. Blanche decides to stay. And what this does is it just proves the lie. So, what Sioux Falls residents frequently said was, we're not opposed to divorce. We're opposed to the divorce colonists. We're opposed to people coming here and abusing the law. If only they'd stay, we would not consider this to be a problem. Well, Blanche stays, and they consider it to be a very big problem. Sioux Falls is not ready to accept a divorce colonist in their ranks.
So first she gets in trouble for saying the quiet part out loud that I'm here to get divorced, and then they're mad at her for staying.
Then they're mad at her for trying to play by the rules. She marries and she stays and she wants to be a part of the Sioux Falls community, and that is not something that the townspeople are open to.
And then the last woman that you talk about is Flora Bigelow Dodge.
Flora is an interesting character because she feels very modern to me. Flora is the daughter of a well-known family in New York. Her father was a statesman of all kinds of various titles. Flora is a a writer and sort of a woman about town. She's really considered like a bon vivant, right? Like she's adored. And when people talk about her husband, they're sort of like, yeah, he's just not quite as great. He's fine. He's just not quite as great. Um, and Flora marries for love, and Flora divorces because she's unhappy. Not because her husband tried to institutionalize her, not because her mother-in-law tried to throw her out of the house, not because her husband's a murderer. She just sees a path to a happier life. And so she feels really modern to me in that way. So she comes out to Sioux Falls with the intention of getting what she calls a legal and dignified Dakota divorce. And it's her contention that this has not happened previously. They have been neither legal nor dignified. The legal question is a tough one. As I mentioned, they are not necessarily going to be honored in your home state. And in fact, as Flora is heading out to Sioux Falls, we actually get a US Supreme Court case in which we discover that a Sioux Falls divorce can be overturned.
Oh, we're definitely going to get into that later.
What it means for Flora is that she needs to think really hard about what legal is and what she's willing to sacrifice. So she decides that if getting a legal divorce means spending the rest of her life in Sioux Falls, she is going to do that. She decides that if she has to give up her New York life, she will do so. So that's the legal part. It's thinking a lot about what it really means to be a resident, whether that needs to be an ongoing thing, what jurisdiction you fall under, where this divorce might be challenged. She's out there also with her two children, and they are part of her campaign to be accepted in Sioux Falls. So she just has this charm offensive. She buys a house. She enrolls her daughter in Bishop Hare's school. She joins the women's groups. She's a census taker. She just does everything she can to enmesh herself in the community. And it works. When she gets her divorce, she gets messages of congratulations. She gets people stopping her on the street. She has really figured out how to make it okay that she did this. It took work. She does not spend the rest of her life in Sioux Falls. She decides that she will be safe, but she was prepared to.
Okay, so let's go back to that court case that you mentioned.
Yeah. So at the same time that Maggie and Mary are out in Sioux Falls, so in the early 1890s, there was a man there named Charles Andrews. He's from Boston. Uh, his father owns a newspaper there. He'd worked for it for a while. And he is part of that first reviled divorce colony. The ones that are drinking and dancing and, generally kicking up their heels. He gets his divorce and he immediately goes back to Boston. And shortly thereafter, he remarries. He has a couple of kids with his wife. His father passes away, which is going to be important in just a minute. And then at a very young age, Charles passes away. Now, when his father died, there was a lot of money that came to Charles. And after Charles's death, that money is going to go to his wife. However, there is a big question now of who is his wife. Because his first wife has decided to make a claim on the estate as his spouse. This makes its way all the way through Massachusetts courts to the Supreme Court, which decides that the divorce is invalid. It decides that Charles's second wife, his second marriage, was bigamous, and that his children are illegitimate, and that his fortune belongs to his first wife. And that's just chaos. How can you possibly function that way? The finding was based on the question of jurisdiction and the idea that although South Dakota claimed jurisdiction and Charles met those requirements, Massachusetts did not have to give up its claim on its citizens so easily. So basically, it was the idea that South Dakota's requirements were absurdly short, um, and Massachusetts did not have to give up its control of its resident because he'd gone away for 3 months. And so you saw this throughout the course of the divorce colony. You saw these cases being challenged and even decided against in state courts, but never at this sort of level of precedent. They were individual fights, and they were typically individual fights over either reputation or money. The thing to know is that in most cases, your divorce was safe because the only person who could challenge your divorce was your former spouse. And either that was a mutually agreed upon decision or a sort of grudgingly agreed upon decision. But few people wanted to stay married to someone who didn't want to be married so badly that they traveled out to Sioux Falls for a year in order to get away. So the number of cases that this happens in and the question marks around the divorce were less tenuous than the Supreme Court case seemed to make it. And the Supreme Court case did not slow the number of people who went to South Dakota. They just sort of overlooked that.
It is interesting looking at, although we said earlier that two-thirds of the divorce seekers were women, that does still mean a third of them were men. And, I stand by the whole divorce is a feminist women's rights issue, but part of that is also, we've seen the evolution of divorce laws where we have things like alimony, we have things like child support, whereas I'm guessing that when that guy divorced his wife, he wasn't obligated to financially provide for her or their kids.
You would see alimony occasionally. It happened in Mary's case, but not frequently, and certainly not with the understanding that a woman had contributed to the success of the man and was therefore, deserving of part of that wealth. It was more of a societal understanding that the woman should not be abandoned. So you did see it sometime, but not frequently. The assumption and the typical path was that the woman would quickly remarry.
Because it turned
And
out so well the first time.
when I tell these stories, I do find that people are often disappointed to realize that the women typically remarry and remarry quickly. And I understand where that reaction comes from. But I think it's really important to understand that all these women wanted to do was exercise their own decision making. So being able to choose to remarry was an act of independence. It was an act of choosing what path their lives would take. The idea of stepping out of society and being a single woman at this time, being just a divorcee, would have been even more challenging than, going and getting that divorce. So it's not surprising, but I also don't think it undermines the independence these women showed in seeking divorces.
I don't mind it if it's a choice. I think it bothers me if the implication is that they were pushed into it. Because I think a lot of these women, either because of social, like family pressure, or because they were young and more naive, that, they ended up in marriages that were not good for them in one way or another. And so it's very much like you said, if it is them exercising their agency and they're independent to choose that, then that's great. It's more that feeling that if you have to, like if that's sort of your only option to take care of yourself and possibly your kids, I think that's where it gets very frustrating, especially when they've gone to all
Yeah.
this trouble to get out of a bad marriage. You hope that, the second time around, it'll be a better situation for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll see in the book, Maggie marries for love. She doesn't need money. And Flora marries for love. When Mary remarries, and she has a long and happy, seemingly, relationship after that, but I would say that was more of an economic decision at the start. And certainly when Blanche remarries, she's looking for respectability. So yes, it is serving many functions for them.
You mentioned as well that although the divorce colony did not survive as such, darn, it was a Pyrrhic victory for the people who were freaking out about this idea that there was like a divorce epidemic, which I kind of feel like there are people still freaking out about that today. But did this lead to increased rights and like sort of how we developed more of those over time?
So what you see happen in South Dakota in 1907, 1908 is the final closure of the divorce colony. They ultimately expand their residency requirements to a year, same as any place else, and there is no longer an attraction to going to Sioux Falls. So this looks like it's following the typical pattern. It is a frontier town that has, strengthened its laws, made them stricter, and is now going to sort of hew the party line of the rest of the country. Instead, what happens is one, we get another census report. And this census report again counts the number of marriages and divorces. And what we discover is that 20 years of having the Sioux Falls divorce colony front and center, 20 years of this panic, 20 years nearly of religious obstacles, of legislative obstacles, of judicial obstacles, they didn't slow the rate of divorce. People are going to continue seeking divorces. And there's a academic who looks at these numbers and very wisely says, perhaps we should consider the increasing number of divorces as a rising of our ideals. The idea is there aren't more bad marriages, these numbers say. There are more people saying, oh, this bad marriage is not where I'm going to stay. Um, so what happens after Sioux Falls is everyone goes to Reno. And Reno is something that a lot of people have heard about because over the course of the next couple of decades, you will see, with one very small exception, the residency requirements in Nevada getting shorter and shorter and shorter until you needed to go there for 6 weeks in order to get a divorce. So although Sioux Falls divorce colony closes, it's the tipping point. It's the last time anyone won. And I really think it's because, one, nothing slowed down these women from coming and seeking the freedom they needed. And two, for almost 20 years, you heard people saying divorce is the downfall of the family and the downfall of the country. And you know what? Both of those were still fine. Attitudes really start to change around divorce after Sioux Falls. There is much more acceptance. People are not ostracized from their families and communities in the same way they were before. Laws change more slowly. And I think that's why we didn't recognize the importance of Sioux Falls previously. A lot of the history, a lot of the thinking around divorce was very much from a legal perspective. And it takes years before South Carolina and New York think, oh, this isn't working. And again, I will caution they didn't decide to make their divorce laws less strict because they suddenly understood the importance of this to women's rights. Uh, they decided to make them less strict because people kept finding ways around them. And so if people are just leaving their marriages, if, as at one point in New York, they're going down to a state in Mexico for one day to get a divorce, or, as also happened in New York, you have built this cottage industry of actresses who will pretend to be the other woman for couples who mutually want to get divorced. Um, then you no longer have control of marriage and divorce. And these states wanted control of marriage and divorce. So they needed to have more logical rules. Finally, we get to the idea of no fault divorce, which was actually an attempt to give the courts more control. Um, and the courts didn't want more control. They wanted people to just be able to figure this stuff out on their own. But the evolution is really important. Something that I realized in writing this was in the United States, we have this civil rights narrative when it comes to marriage. You know, we have Loving and Obergefell. We have the extension of marriage rights to more people, and we understand that to be a civil rights victory. We've never thought about divorce in the same way, but you can't have the freedom to marry who you love if you don't also have the freedom to divorce them. You have to have both of those things to be able to choose how you want to live. And I think that's the story I got out of Sioux Falls.
Join us next time on the Infinite Women podcast, and remember, well behaved women rarely make history.